Fires here in the Northwest, it's no longer a question of if we'll see fires, but when and how bad they will be. This week, we're taking a closer look at what it means to be living with wildfires. Our Environment Northwest team is bringing you in-depth reports on our wildfire risk, smoke dangers, and what it takes to recover after the flames are out. We'll have stories all week from across Oregon and Washington, taking a look at what increases that fire risk and the solutions being worked on now. Tonight, Spokane meteorologist Jeremy Legoux explains why this wildfire season will likely be an active one for Washington, increasing the potential for smoke throughout the Northwest. After that, we'll hear from KGW's chief meteorologist Matt Zaffino with a closer look at the risk to Oregon. First, Jeremy.
We were driving up and over the mountain pass, and then on the side of the road were two logs still smoldering to the point that when I pulled them out into the road, they started back on fire, completely unattended. Nobody in sight, and we haven't seen anyone in a very long time. This is how wildfires start.
We're seeing more human-caused wildfires.
After 8 years in the role as Commissioner of Public Lands, Hillary Franz knows wildfire risk, and this year has it.
We are predicting significant wildfire risk for the state of Washington as we head into the 2024 season.
Coming out of our El Niño winter, things are dry. The El Niño brought warmer temperatures and less moisture to the Northwest, and forecast models indicate that trend will likely continue through most of summer. La Niña conditions are emerging, but the cool, wet pattern likely won't arrive in the Northwest until fall. Drought conditions are present in the northern Rockies, Cascades, and even the Olympic Mountains. The drying out that started a year ago continued through winter with a much lower snowpack. Timber takes a long time to dry out and just as long to regain its moisture, meaning our forests will be more prone to wildfires this year. When timber burns, it creates the most smoke and air quality concerns, even though it's not what typically gives us the most acres burned in a year. That's grass or fine fuels. An abundance of moisture in southern Idaho and eastern Oregon this year allowed those grasses and fine fuels the ability to thrive. While that might sound like a good thing initially, those fuels typically dry out quickly in the heat of summer and ignite easily and burn quickly. Here in the Northwest, our fire danger worsens throughout the heat of summer. This year, we not only have the fine fuels like grasses and vegetation drying out, but the drier forests to contend with as well. Hot, dry, windy conditions or critical fire weather days are becoming more common as our climate changes. An entire fire season can boil down to just one day, something we saw back in 2020 in Malden, or just last year in the Oregon Road or Gray fires. Now more than ever, it comes down to us. The El Niño pattern responsible for warm, dry weather also means fewer storms and less lightning, so almost all of the wildfires this year will be caused by people. For Environment Northwest, I'm meteorologist Jeremy Legoux.
Let's go over now to KGW Chief Meteorologist Matt Zaffino. Matt, what's the outlook look like for Oregon this year?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Let's set the stage, though, with the increase in the number of what we call fire weather days. Now, these are not the days where we have fires burning necessarily, but it's a combination where fire weather conditions are bad. So you need to have it hot, very dry, and very windy. And if we look at the Willamette Valley in Portland over the last 50 or so years, from 1973 to 2023, we've seen an increase in days that qualify as fire weather days by about 3, which is not too bad, right? But again, this is on the west side of the Cascades where we tend to have a lot of marine air, tends to keep things down, and you don't have as many fire weather days, or you have that combination of all three: hot weather, very low humidity, and very windy conditions. Eastern Oregon, it's a different story. This is for south central Oregon, and over that same time period, they've seen an increase of 23 days. So now we have nearly a month more days where you have it very hot, very dry, and windy. So if there is a fire, or if a fire starts, it can spread dramatically and critically and dangerously with conditions like this. So that is sort of the background of where we are with climate change and the increase in the number of fire weather days. And that's the case throughout most of the western United States. Here in Oregon, you see the increases most pronounced east of the Cascades, but we have seen an increase in the Willamette Valley as well. So that's what we're facing in our changing climate, just days that are more conducive to wild burning and critical burning. So what about our snowpack? We had a good snowpack in Oregon, unlike Washington, the northern Rockies, where the El Nino winter created a very, very dry winter. We didn't suffer that in Oregon. Our snowpack this year was really quite good. It was average to above average for much of the state, and we don't really have much of a critical drought situation right now in Oregon either. That's all good because the longer the forest stays moist, the less the wildfire threat will be. That said, there's always a wildfire threat, and that threat is now a $1 billion threat. If you look at disasters through the course of the year, wildfire is the darkest red here, but from June really into November, it can go into the billions of dollars when we get a devastating wildfire like we've seen in recent years. So bottom line, what's the forecast for this summer? Well, the forecast for the summer weather, temperatures hotter than normal, which is not good, of course. Now, what we want to avoid is that combination, like those graphics I showed you, where it's hot and it's windy and it's very, very low humidity all at once. Remember, that sets the stage for some of our worst fires, like back in September of 2020, coming off the long dry season, which is normal. We don't get a lot of rain in the Northwest in the summer, but then we had that raging east wind. Low humidity, very windy. We had existing fires on the ground, and they just blew up and created some of the worst fires we've seen in the Northwest. That's what you want to avoid, is when you get all of those things happening at the same time. So look at it this way for the 2024 wildfire season. Our summer is going to be warm and dry. It always is. With an El Nino season, we tend to be a little warmer and drier than normal, so we're facing that. We've got a good snowpack, so that's on the plus side of the ledger, right? But the fire seasons have been starting earlier, and they don't end until we get the fall rain, and that can be early September or it can be later into October. What we really want to avoid, Evan, is when we get, like we did in 2020, a big east wind event before we get the fall rains. That was unusual, and hopefully that doesn't happen again anytime soon.
Yeah, Matt, and you talked about the differences in location for those fire weather days, seeing how many more have spread elsewhere. What does that look like when it comes to how fires then spread across the state of Oregon, where they begin and then how they move from that point forward?
And that is all dependent on the weather. It's a great question. So if you get a fire start, and whether it's human caused or lightning caused, if after that fire begins, you get a lot of wind and you get a lot of hot weather, and we know our summers are getting hotter with climate change. That's one of the reasons why our fires have become so much more severe, because the pump is just primed for them to spread more easily. Remember, fire loves it when it's hot, loves it when it's windy, and it will spread rapidly in those conditions. So on any specific fire, you can't really forecast that in advance. You got to wait and see what the conditions are around that fire. But we know that the antecedent, the precedent conditions are generally hotter, and that's why we're seeing an increase in wildfire, not only in the western United States, but western Canada already has fires burning right now. They've already been suffering through smoke back in the Midwest, because that's where the winds have taken that Canadian wildfire smoke. And we've seen that here in the Northwest too, wildfire smoke coming from as far away as Russia and the Arctic. So when you get to a specific fire and how it's going to travel, that's really dependent on the weather, the day of, and the weeks around that fire.
Got it. Well, thank you very much, Matt. A lot for us to keep track of, and a lot that we know our consumers and the people watching the news and keeping up with all this will be tracking this summer as well. Thanks. Well, the smoke from these wildfires is wiping out decades of progress on air quality in the Pacific Northwest. Coming up tomorrow, our Environment Northwest team explains the steps you can take to protect yourself from home and the smoke and the haze. We're now just a day away from Oregon's primary election, and ballots are trickling in. If you haven't submitted yours yet, you've got until 8 tomorrow. You can stick them in the mail or drop them in a ballot drop box. They'll be accepted as long as they're postmarked by tomorrow. And as Thomas Schultz tells us, there's concern this year that fewer people are voting than usual.
Slowly but surely, Oregonians are mailing and dropping off their ballots.
I always feel like voting is important because that's how people's voices are heard.
And in Multnomah County, the Elections Division is busy sorting what comes in. Though this year, far fewer ballots have been counted than usual.
We're quite a bit below the May 2020 presidential primary.
Tim Scott is the director of elections in Multnomah County. So far, around 16% of county voters have cast ballots. And Secretary of State results show just 26% of Democrats and 28% of Republicans have returned ballots statewide. And Scott says in Multnomah County, there's two reasons turnout is down.
One of the differences this year is the presidential primaries have been locked up by this point. I think there's less interest because of that.
And second, Portland contests moved to November.
Of course, there are still lots of competitive races in Multnomah County.
Like a race for district attorney between current DA Mike Schmidt and prosecutor Nathan Vasquez, and several county commission seats, too.
I'm getting ready to drop off my ballot.
And many voters, like Sierra Madro, are still sending in ballots.
We've had a lot of changes in the city over the years, and it's important to continue to have the type of leadership that we think best represents us.
And eventually, officials expect 36% of Multnomah County voters to cast votes, though that's still a far cry from the 51% of voters who participated in May elections 4 years ago.
It's disappointing because it feels like people don't really care about things that are happening that could directly affect them.
In Portland, Thomas Schultz, KGW News.
KGW will have you covered on election night. David Molko and Laurel Porter, along with our political analysts, will break down the results as they come in. It starts at 7:45 tomorrow night. You can watch it on channel 8.2 if you get our signal on antenna. It's also available on Comcast channel 308. We'll be streaming the show on KGW Plus, the KGW YouTube channel, and KGW.com. Any way you take it. By the way, we know a lot of you are counting down until the primary is over. For the sake of your commercial breaks and mailboxes, the political ads are only going to pick up steam in the next couple of months, though. And some of them are even hitting our phones. Have you been getting political ads in your text messages? Turns out there's no way to fully stop that from flooding your phone. Adding your number to the National Do Not Call Registry only stops phone calls from telemarketers, but political campaigns and scammers are still allowed both to call you and text you. The FCC does prohibit robocalls and texts. Those come through automatic dialer systems. You should be able to opt out of those by texting stop or unsubscribe in response to the message. But if the text comes from a real-life person, there's no way to stop it ahead of time. Some campaigns use text bankers to get their message out. You can always still ask to be unsubscribed, of course. The FCC does say that campaigns should honor opt-out requests. But keep an eye out for scammers. As always, if a text looks suspicious, it's best not to reply and just to block their number and, of course, move on with your life. Still ahead on the story. It's now been a decade since same-sex marriage has been legal in Oregon. But that moment only half the story. We look back even further to the very first gay marriage in Multnomah County and the years-long fight to get us where we are today. Sunday marked a milestone in queer history in Oregon. It was May 19, 2014, that a U.S. district judge overturned the state's voter-approved ban on same-sex marriage. 10 years ago, couples were lined up outside the Multnomah building, ready to tie the knot as soon as that final ruling came down. Judge Michael McShane determined Oregon's marriage laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. For many couples at the time, it gave legal validation to their unions, some who had been together for decades at that point.
This is our 25-year anniversary.
We've been together 23 years this August.
It's really exciting. We've been waiting to get married for years, and I can't believe it's finally happening.
Surreal, amazing, beautiful, thankful, grateful.
But that is only half the story. The legal battle for gay marriage actually started more than 20 years ago.
By the vows and promises you have exchanged with each other, and by the power vested in me by the state of Oregon, I declare you to be married.
It was March 2004. Multnomah County became the first in Oregon to begin issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. But it didn't last long. Legal challenges were filed, and later that year, voters approved a constitutional amendment that strictly defined marriage between a man and a woman. It passed by a margin of 57% to 43% ultimately. Then in 2005, the Oregon Supreme Court ruled that Multnomah County did not have the authority to issue same-sex licenses. That resulted in the nullification of nearly 3,000 marriages.
And it was, a special time in history, a special time for us, and then, about a month or so later, when that all got annulled, it was devastating for us. I mean, it created a second class. We felt like second class citizens at that point because they say, sorry, your love doesn't count.
A lot has changed in the 20 years since as we look at this on the anniversary. While advocates say there's still progress left to be made, in at least one way, Oregon is leading the movement. Last month, an affordable senior living complex specifically for people within the LGBTQ+ community opened in Cedar Mill. And the federal government has proposed a rule that would require anyone who wants to be a foster parent to support LGBTQ+ kids in their care. Oregon already has its own version of that rule, which coincidentally faces a legal challenge. A sign that while history has a sort of cycle, you can also see its progression if you take the time to look back. Still ahead, it's the stuff of Oregon legend, the Rajneesh movement that set up camp in Central Oregon back in the 80s. We're taking a look at some of the historical artifacts from that wild time when we come back. In this week's Digging for Old, we're going to bring you back to Wasco County, Oregon in the 1980s and the phenomenon of the Rajneesh community. KGW created a documentary about it in 1985, and you can bet the Oregon Historical Society has all kinds of items in their collection related to that time in our state's history. Boxes of them, in fact. So we went to take a look.
So one of the most famous or infamous times in Oregon history was the time in the 1980s of the Bhagwan. Bhagwan Rajneesh, the Rajneesh Purim, Ma'anad Sheila. It was headlining the news night after night after night. The Bhagwan and his followers came into Oregon and started buying up land in very rural area around Antelope, creating this camp. Encampment, and as more people came in, they started to build more buildings. It became essentially a little city with lots of Rolls Royces, because the Bhagwan preferred to be driven in only Rolls Royces. Soon there were hundreds and thousands of people living there, and they needed more space, needed more infrastructure, and eventually they all registered to vote. And then they basically took over the town of Antelope through elections, elected a mayor and city council, and changed the city's name from Antelope to Rajneesh Purim. The Bhagwan's top aide was Ma'anad Sheila, and she kind of was the spokesman and ran the show as he just went back and forth in his Rolls Royce, waving at his followers. Eventually, it led to one of the largest bioterrorism incidents in the country. The Rajneesh followers, at someone's order, poisoned a salad bar at a restaurant in the Dalles, leading to some sickness and illnesses for people. Eventually, the law stepped in. Oregon's Secretary of State, then Norma Paulus, looking at whether the legality of this election. Long story short, eventually the Bhagwan ended up being indicted for tax evasion and was spirited out of the country on a jet. And Ma'anad Sheila faced some legal issues. And of course, several years ago, there was a documentary on Netflix, Wild, Wild Country, which told the story of Rajneesh Purim to an entire new audience of people who had never heard about it before. And these two boxes here contain some of the items from our collection involving that time period. Here we've got such items as a little plaque here, ex-Antelope, Oregon residents. Our city was stolen. Telling the story there. You've got a message here. Note that there are bullet holes in it. So someone was not pleased with that sign. You've got, they changed all the street names of Antelope to go in kind of with the Rajneesh Purim. You've got, of course, they put up electric fences in many of the areas there. Some items over here, but wait, there's more. Again, pointing out the controversy. This was a fly swatter, but on it says Bhagwan swatter. Different hats here. Antelope Border Patrol, obviously worn by some of the Antelope residents. You've got just one that says Rajneesh Purim. This would have been probably some of the followers might have worn that. Different shirts. Nuke the Guru. You know what side of the debate that they were on. Again, more an official looking shirt here. Just says Rajneesh Purim on it. And more items, all dealing with the controversy. Save an antelope, bag a Bhagwan.
Any of you longtime Oregonians have any Rajneesh memories to share with us? We'd like to hear them. Email a story at kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail 503-226-5090. Well, that is the end of our show for tonight. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, the story, our story, never ends, and we'll be excited to see you again back here tomorrow. See you then.